when we were preparing for this show, I was talking to Sean from Outset Group about mergers and acquisitions and why he was in it and how he'd come to be there. And his CV is actually quite interesting because I've actually instructed mergers and acquisitions lawyers at quite a large firm who will remain nameless to save their embarrassment. And we got quite a lot of information and an awful lot of paper, but very little advice. And when I'm in CEO mode, I really need somebody to point me in the right direction and tell me what I should be doing. And funnily enough, that's pretty much how Sean starts. And when we started this, Sean, you were effectively saying that you'd done the law thing and then you did other stuff, and then you came back to really look at M&A. You want to just tell a listener a little bit about your story and how you got to where you got and why you do what you do the way you do it?
Absolutely. Hi, Simon. Good to be here today. Effectively, my background is that for the last 15 years, I've been working in M&A. About 3 years ago, I decided to move from the legal side and go over into a more commercial role. So I was a commercial director of a company, an 80 million turnover business that operated nationally. Prior to that, I'd been a partner at a large regional firm in Kent, and I'd focused on doing mergers and acquisitions. So I had a lot of experience of doing it as a lawyer and advising various different clients, whether that would be people selling, people buying, whether it would be banks that might be involved in that kind of transaction or private equity firms. But that gave me the opportunity to essentially sit on the other side of the fence and see what it's like to instruct lawyers on these matters, other similar matters. So having done that for a couple of years, I joined Outset last year to lead the team that runs effectively all of their corporate finance and merger and acquisition work. So having had that experience of instructed lawyers and having seen, I suppose, what that feels like for someone who's, as you say, if they're in CEO mode or director mode, where you've got a number of different tasks that you need to deal with, and you're looking for advice from somebody, and you really want them to tell you that these are the options, and if I'm honest, this is probably what I would do if I was in your shoes. That's what you really want, I think, from an advisor. And that, I think, I would hope that's how I had developed before having that experience, but certainly that crystallized in my mind. What do you really want from an advisor, whether it be your accountant or your lawyer? What you want is a very quick, short, sharp, these are, I think, what the key issues are, and if I was you, this is probably what I would do in your situation. And then be available to discuss that as well, and explain why that's what you think.
Well, you got to be able to back it up, but it does often seem, in financial services, a standing joke that compliance people, who are effectively compliance lawyers who just have a very narrow field and possibly aren't legally trained, are paid by the word. So effectively, you end up with reports that the compliance lawyers have put together that are 50 pages long.
Yeah.
And the truth is, the nub of the advice could be covered in a side of A4.
Absolutely.
But of course, you've got to have all your get-out-of-jail-free cards stapled to the back of it, which just seems insane.
And you'll always have that. And I've been on the receiving end of that as a client as well. I know what it's like to receive a 30-page report from a large international accountancy practice and look at it and think, well, what is the actual advice? I've just paid you a large sum of money and I'm not entirely sure what it is you're telling me I should do. So I've been there and I know how frustrating that is. And that, I suppose, as I say, that's what makes you realise what service are you actually providing to your client here. They know that you know the law. They don't want you to tell them that or what the law is. They want you to help them through something that they're relying on your expertise and experience on.
Yeah. And I was sort of saying, from my experience of also having instructed M&A lawyers in CEO mode previously, in a previous life, the problem that you've got, and we were reflecting on this in the green room, is that you've got probably 2 lots of accountants, 2 lots of lawyers, 2 clients and external advisors, and they're all trying to justify their place at the table. I'm going to chuck, this is my idea, this is my thing, why aren't we doing this, that and the other, we need to cover this, this is a big risk, we've got to worry about it. Isn't really. But they've got effectively to justify the fee that they're charging, because they probably are adding some value, but they've got to be seen to be adding that value. And you used a lovely expression, I'm going to give you a chance to remember it before I remind you what you said, but somebody needs to project manage it.
Absolutely.
And that was the bit that I thought you brought in to the party quite nicely. And as a CEO who has bought businesses in the past and will probably do so again in the future at some stage, somebody who would actually make it happen is actually, I wouldn't say worth their weight in gold, because that would only encourage you to quote very high. But they are very, very valuable to the process, because the problem is, if you're running the business, you don't really understand where the pressure points in the transaction are, or who to kick to make things happen. And sometimes it's very hard to work out. There seems to be a job stoppage. It's taking far too long. Why aren't things happening? I did the deal in 5 minutes. I thought Donald Trump, we shook hands in 5 minutes. And so why are the lawyers spending 6 months sorting it out?
I mean, I think there's a couple of points there, actually, which is quite interesting. So talking about what you mentioned about being seen to add value, and I think that's a common criticism. And I think one thing that's quite interesting on that, in my view, is that adding value is, it doesn't mean that you need to raise points. Adding value is knowing when you need to raise a point and when you don't need to. And I think, to me, that's value. And I think also you need to, if we are to, and I think many law firms are in the process of trying to do this, reshape how we deliver services to clients, and really think about what service is it that the client wants from us. Then that project management element of it has to be quite key for mergers and acquisitions, because, as you say, you'll be dealing with a client who has made a decision. They want to go and acquire this business, or they might be a shareholder who's decided they're going to sell the business. The most painful part of this process for them now is the point at which they told you to go and do it, and that basically the period between then and actually doing it and getting it done.
And the consummation.
That's absolutely right. And I think every stakeholder in that process should always be trying to focus on, what does the client want? It wants to complete this deal. You need to understand what risks your client is willing to take, and you need to advise them on those. But ultimately, you all need to work together to achieve what both clients want to achieve, the buyer and the seller, which is to get the deal done, and to get it done within the confines of what is reasonable risk to the seller or the buyer.
Yeah.
And as you say, I think historically, a lot of people perhaps don't. There's not a way of sort of pulling all of that together and saying, right, how do we get from here to there? If a problem arises, how do we unlock that? How do we work out how to get around it in a way that's satisfactory to the buyer and the seller? And also, just very simple project management, really. Where are we? Have we hit that milestone that we want to achieve? If we said we want to achieve completion of this deal in 12 weeks or whatever number that might be, are we suitably progressed? You should be looking at that, really. On a weekly basis, I would say you need to be looking at, have we actually done what we need to do at this point to be able to hit that deadline? I think, if you're looking at projects in any other area of industry, you'd always have a project manager who's monitoring. Are we sufficiently progressed to be able to meet that timeline? And if you're not, then you need to be taking steps to address that. And I think that's, for me, that's how I would like to approach a deal, and I think that's what a client would want from me as well.
It's interesting you should say that. I actually had an email from a lawyer last night. As it happens, I haven't brought it up before. This is new information to everybody in the room. But we were instructed to facilitate a pension sharing order. It wasn't a huge amount of money. Lady came in. We made the appropriate application. We had the order from the court, duly stamped by the court. We chucked it at the insurance company. The insurance company chucked it at the seeding scheme. And we have literally 5 pages of progress chasing notes on this case, where my admin team, bless them, because I hadn't any idea, I'd forgotten about it, have been chasing this thing for nearly a year to get this blasted thing through. And for whatever reason, it had been a nightmare. Now, the trustees of the seeding scheme were really the blockage. They were being particularly fastidious and particularly awkward, although to be fair, in the pensions arena these days, everybody has to be incredibly cautious, because the potential litigation in the future is absolutely horrendous. But the interesting thing was, we had all these progress notes. So when I got this email from the lawyer, and speaking to lawyers, as anybody gets a lawyer's letter on anything, even if it's about mutual business, it's slightly nerve-wracking as a financial advisor. Am I going to get sued on this, whatever? the last piece of information in the file was my email to the lawyer, dated May last year, saying we've taken this as far as we possibly can, but we're just getting nowhere. It's over to you. You've got to beat the ceiling scheme over the head legally or something because nothing's happening. And so from May to then, it had fallen off everybody's radar, including the lawyers, I think, as it happened. And it was now going back to court to try and get this whole matter resolved. But the interesting point was that all these things need to be pushed and pushed and pushed. Now, in our case, I have to put my hands up on this particular instance. It had fallen off our follow-up system merely because we're already in loss on this case, and to be quite frank, we'd lost interest. But from the other side, I think that had fallen off their progress management system, because the case had just been allowed to drift for a long time and nothing happened. And actually having a lawyer who sits there and say, it's about project management, it's about having a timeline, it's about hitting milestones, is absolutely crucial. And all too often, that seems to be forgotten. A lot of professional services firms seem to operate on that basis, sort of almost manana.
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, it's what's the service? Is the service, do you come to you, does a client come to you because they want you to advise on the content of a document and tell you what's in them and tell you the risks? That's one part of what you do. But if you really want to add value, as we talked about before, well, then your service is, not only am I going to give you those risks, but actually I'm going to drive this forward.
I'm going to make the deal happen.
I'm going to make this happen for you. Well, because actually that's what you really want from me.
Yes. Isn't it just? And the interesting thing is, when they walk through the door, the client probably doesn't know that.
Absolutely.
They're often sold the sizzle, but what they actually want is the perishing sausage. Yeah. And it's an old line, but it's so true. They actually want somebody to tell them what to do and make it happen and make their life simple, because they don't understand the intricacies of mergers and acquisitions. With all due respect to the listener who does, most clients don't. And I mean, I certainly didn't when I did my first big deal. I had no idea what I was doing. I was totally in the hands of the lawyers, and to be fair, they were actually pretty good. But it was all new to us. I knew about financial services. I knew what we were buying. I understood the nature of their business. I understood most, but not all, of the business risks. There were a few things that I hadn't appreciated could actually come and bite us in the bum that the lawyers educated us on, which was quite handy. But actually making it happen was actually the key service. And I don't think any law firm or many professional services practices actually market themselves as, we're the people that make your deal happen. And
it's an interesting one. I don't know. I can't say that I've seen it before. I'd like to think that's how I talk about it.
Yeah, well, it's probably why you're so successful, relatively young, sitting here as a granddad, which you're clearly not. All right, so we've done a little bit of introductory work. Let's ask a wider question. What is it that people are looking for? What ought people to be looking for when they're looking to acquire another business? What would you say? I wrote a list when we were in the green room, so let's see what you can remember of what we said.
Well, I think the first point is, and you've nailed it really, is that you should always know what it is you're looking for.
Yeah.
You shouldn't go into the process just thinking, I'm gonna go and buy a company, and I don't think many people do. It's probably a slightly facetious comment. I think you need to be thinking, there is some CEOs do sort of measure themselves by how big they are. So if I buy a business, by definition, I'm bigger. So that must be a definition of success. And I think that is wrong thinking to start with, because bigger is not always better. Turnover is vanity, profit is sanity. Another old marketing speak line that I seem to remember picking up somewhere. But it really is important. Just buying extra turnover doesn't really achieve anything. So you've got to be very, very clear about what you're trying to achieve. That's quite right. I think if you're buying turnover, then you're unless you've got a strategic reason to do that, then that might be not the right driver. But I mean, I think normally you've got to go into it and be looking at what you'll say. If you've got a 5-year plan for the growth of the business, then you need to be thinking, well, how do I achieve that? So, properly looking at the strategy of the business. This is where we are now. This is where we want to be. How do we get there?
Yeah.
If that is growth, then it might well be that how are you going to achieve that growth? Is that because do you want to expand regionally? So in which case, if you're making an acquisition, is it because you want to get a foothold in a different part of the country? Is it that you want to operate in a slightly different industry, diversify slightly? So do you want to have a complementary service that sits within your business? Is it simply that actually you've got a supplier that you work with and they're so integrated in your business that you just want to have them as part of your group rather than as a supplier? And going back to the to the other reasons why you might want to do an acquisition, you might be looking to buy in particular expertise. You might just want particular new clients, and you might have
some intellectual property you want to get a hold of.
Exactly, some intellectual property.
Nice word. You wanted to buy some capability. I wrote that one down. That was a nice word. You want to acquire some capability.
Yeah.
There are a number of ways of doing it, but the Harvard statistic that we trailed is 70 to 90% of these acquisitions end in failure. And my own view, and you may contradict me, and I'm very happy to be contradicted on air. Just about every guest does one way or the other at the end of it. But my own view is the reason 79 to 90% are deemed to be failure is because there aren't appropriate management metrics in place up front to determine what success actually looks like. For me to be perceived, for me to feel I've got good value for my £1 million or whatever it is I'm just spending on this business, I need to see X amount more turnover. I need to have X amount new clients. I need to have whatever. I need to have acquired this intellectual property. Those are my determinants of what is success or what is failure. And the fact that you've got a whole pile of people and they've all churned because they didn't buy into the new culture or whatever, and you've had all sorts of HR issues and bits and pieces, which are often the things that do seem to go wrong with M&A, we'll come on to that later, is almost a byproduct. Because if you've achieved your main objective to some degree, and if you've churned a lot of people, then that's not a very nice way of doing it. If you've achieved your strategic objective of getting more turnover, more profit, more clients, some intellectual property or whatever,
it may be,
it's actually a success. But in human terms, it's often a car crash because people haven't actually done the HR piece in the middle to actually get the people on board.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you say, who knows how that statistic was, was put together, and I think you've got to, as we said, you've got to go into something like this thinking, what is it that I want to achieve from doing it? And if you are going to be thinking about it after the event in terms of success or failure, then you need to know what success or failure looks like. And I think the people that do acquisitions successfully are the people who have a very clear idea not only of what success looks like, but also of how they get to that success. And they understand what it is. It's not going to be a case of we pay the money, we do the deal, we now own this business. What do we do now? People that have a clear plan of what they do from the point at which they acquire that business to getting to success, because that's the critical period for any buyer of a business.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think this is a good time for a little pause.